Regarding the Soviet Union, here was a nation that threw back and destroyed the Nazi beast and sustained 80% of the Allied losses in the war, 22 million dead. Here was a nation that in 3 decades made industrial advances equal to what it took capitalism a century to accomplish, while feeding and schooling its children rather than working them 14 hours a day, as the capitalists did during the Industrial Revolution. Here was a nation that provided vital assistance, material, military, medical, armed assistance to liberation movements in Vietnam, Cuba, Nicaragua, South Africa, Angola, and other countries. Here was one of the few countries that, for all its injustices and dysfunctional structures, did guarantee its citizens some minimal economic security. Ladies and gentlemen, I say it without flinching, communism in Eastern Europe, Russia, China, Mongolia, North Korea, and Cuba brought land reform and human services, a dramatic bettering of the living conditions of hundreds of millions of people on a scale never before or never since witnessed in human history. Communism transformed desperately poor countries into societies in which everyone had adequate food, shelter, medical care, and education. To say that socialism doesn't work is to overlook the fact that it did work, and it worked for hundreds of millions of people.
From 1989 to 1991, remarkable transformations swept across Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union as communist governments were overthrown and large portions of their publicly owned economies were dismantled, privatized, and sold at bargain prices. The relatively peaceful transition from communism to capitalism challenged the conventional perception of unscrupulous totalitarians willing to do anything to maintain control over captive populations. The narrative of communists as ruthless, power-hungry demagogues is pinned to no individual more so than Joseph Stalin. The number of estimated casualties during Stalin's rule vary widely and are based primarily on speculation by writers who rely on either unnamed sources or sources that trace back to fascist allies or sympathizers. The figures offered by anti-communist writers are dramatically inconsistent and increasing every year. Roy Mendeveev puts Stalin's victims at 5 to 7 million. Robert Conquest decided on 7 to 8 million. Olga Shatunovskaya claims 19.8 million just for the period from 1935 to 1940. Stephen Cohen says 9 million by 1939. Arthur Kessler tells us it was 20 to 25 million. And William Rusher brazenly claims that 100 million people were wantonly murdered by communist dictators since the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. Unburdened by any documentation, these estimates invite us to conclude that the sum total of people either killed or incarcerated in the Soviet Union would have constituted an astonishing portion of the entire population, which stood at 169 million in 1939. But in the absence of reliable evidence, we are instead fed anecdotes, such as the story Winston Churchill tells of the time he asked Stalin how many people died in the famine. According to Churchill, the Soviet leader responded by raising both his hands, a gesture that may have signified an unwillingness to broach the subject. But Churchill assumed, without any clarification, that Stalin was confessing to 10 million victims. However, this is not to suggest that excesses by the Soviet state did not occur. We know, for example, that many people were executed in Stalin's purges. Victims of the purges were primarily Communist Party officials, managers, military officers, and other strategically situated individuals whom Stalin saw fit to either incarcerate or liquidate. Between 1921 to 1953, total executions carried out by the Soviets numbered 799,455. However, no breakdown has ever been provided as to how researchers arrived at this figure, but many authors include murderers, counter-revolutionaries, traitors, as well as Nazi collaborators and SS prisoners within these figures. In 1993, after historians gained access to previously secret Soviet police archives, they were able to access well-documented estimates of prisons and labor camp populations. They found that the total number of the entire Gulag near the end of the Great Purges in 1939 was just over 2 million. At about that same time, there began a new purge of many intelligence and secret police officials, as well as members of the judiciary and other investigative committees, suddenly being held responsible for the crimes committed during the Terror. Despite the harsh conditions of Soviet labor camps, they were not death camps like those that the Nazis had built across Europe. There was no systematic extermination of inmates, no gas chambers or crematoria to dispose of millions of bodies. In fact, the great majority of Gulag inmates eventually returned to society when granted amnesty or when their prison sentence was finished. According to archive records, 20 to 40% of the inmates were released in any given year, with almost 1 million released during the war to serve in the military. Archives reveal that more than half of all Gulag deaths between 1934 and 1953 occurred during the war, and resulted mostly from malnutrition, when severe privation was the common lot. Some Russian anti-communist writers, like Solzhenitsyn, as well as various US liberals, maintain that the Gulag existed right down to the last days of communism. But according to NKVD files, after Stalin's death in 1953, more than half of the Gulag inmates were freed, and the Gulags themselves slowly disappeared. One of the last remaining Soviet labor camps was visited in 1989 by Republican congressmen and again in 1990 by French journalists, both parties finding that only a few dozen prisoners remained. Despite the suggestions of anti-communist propaganda in the capitalist West, mass atrocities were not being committed right down to the last days of communism. This is why there was no attempt made to bring communist dictators to justice after the fall of the USSR. There were no Nuremberg-style public trials, no documents detailing alleged widespread atrocities, and hardly any attempts to even hold communist leaders accountable for the alleged millions they exterminated. One of the only efforts made was in West Germany, charging East German leader Erich Honecker and several border guards for shooting people who attempted to escape over the Berlin Wall. A serious charge, but hardly indicative of a death camp. In 1995, Miroslav Stefan, the former secretary of the Prague Communist Party, was sentenced to 2.5 years for ordering police to use tear gas and water cannons against demonstrators in 1988. Turning tear gas and water cannons hardly even qualifies as a crime in most Western countries, but it is taken as a serious crime when committed by bloodthirsty, power-hungry Reds.
Many people don't realize it, but most of Eastern Europe, before World War II, and certainly after World War II, given the additional destruction, most of Eastern Europe was a third world region. Thousands of villages were reduced to rubble. Illiteracy, poverty, disease, coal, hunger was the common lot among the peasantry and much of the working class, as it was before the war. Capital formation was almost non-existent. The same was true of pre-revolutionary Russia. The same was true of pre-revolutionary China. Henry Rosemont, he notes that when the communists liberated Shanghai from the US-sponsored Kuomintang reactionary government in 1949, the communists found that about 20% of the population in Shanghai, 1.2 million people, were drug addicts. And every morning, special crews of street cleaners, quote, would gather up the corpses of children and adults who had been murdered during the night or died of disease, cold, and starvation. Communism, ladies and gentlemen, I say it without flinching, communism in Eastern Europe, Russia, China, Mongolia, North Korea, and Cuba brought land reform and human services, a dramatic bettering of the living conditions of hundreds of millions of people on a scale never before or never since witnessed in human history. And that's something to appreciate. Communism transformed desperately poor countries into societies in which everyone had adequate food, shelter, medical care, and education. Now, all of this is not to deny that communist countries suffered internal deficiencies and contradictions. In Eastern Europe and Russia, worker vacation resorts, clinics, cultural centers, daycare centers, and other features that used to make communist enterprises something more than just workplaces, they have just all about disappeared. Worker rest homes have been redone as gambling casinos and nightclubs for the nouveau riche. School lunches, which were once free or very low priced, are too costly for many pupils. Hungry children now constitute a serious school problem.
The greatest setbacks of communist societies came from unrelenting capitalist encirclement. Throughout its entire 73-year history of counter-revolutionary invasion, civil war, forced industrialization, Stalinist purges, deportations, Nazi conquest, Cold War, and a nuclear arms race, the Soviet Union did not know one day of peaceful development. In the attempt to maintain military parity with the United States, the Soviets took on crushing defense costs that seriously depleted their civilian economy, which also faced monetary boycott, discrimination, and embargo from the West. The people who lived under communism endured chronic shortages, long lines, poor quality goods and services, and many other problems. They wanted a better life, and without capitalist encirclement, they would have had a better chance of achieving one. But Western forces tirelessly dedicated themselves to overthrowing the USSR, and they eventually succeeded. It was a triumph for capital that would cost the people of the world dearly. The anti-communists who took power in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union in 1989 to 1991 set about to impose bourgeois dominance and purge communists from the government, media, universities, professions, and courts. The process of so-called democratization began in the US media, leading many on the US left to hail acts of oppression as moving ahead with democratic reforms. In Russia, associates of President Boris Yeltsin talked of the dangers of democracy and complained that most representative bodies have become a hindrance to market reforms. The goal of Yeltsin and the counter-revolutionaries in Russia was not to give power to the people, but profits to the privileged. Gorbachev demanded that the Soviet Congress abolish itself, and after the installation of the new democratic Soviet government of 1989 to 1991, Yeltsin quickly overthrew it while claiming to be undoing the old regime. By late 1993, facing strong popular resistance to his harsh free market policies, Yeltsin went even further by forcibly disbanding the Russian parliament and every other elective representative body in the country, including municipal and regional councils. He abolished Russia's constitutional court and launched an armed attack on the parliament building. The coup killed an estimated 2,000 demonstrators, jailed thousands more without charges or trial, and placed elective representatives under investigation. Yeltsin barred labor unions from all political activities, suppressed dozens of publications, exercised monopoly control over the media, and permanently outlawed 15 political parties. He unilaterally scrapped the Constitution and presented the public with a new one that gave the president near absolute power and authority while reducing the democratically elected parliament to virtual impotence. In the 1996 campaign, he sought to ban the Communist Party while repeatedly announcing that a communist victory would bring about a civil war. Yeltsin's monopoly control over Russia's television networks allowed for campaign coverage that amounted to non-stop promotionals. Through all of this, Yeltsin received vigorous support from the White House and the US media, and benefited from multi-million-dollar donations from US sources as well as a $10 billion aid package from the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. Free market right-wing forces in various Eastern European countries enjoyed significant financial and organizational assistance from US-financed agencies linked to the CIA. Multinational corporations quickly moved into Russia to exploit vast oil and natural gas reserves, as well as rich mineral deposits at great profit to themselves, but little benefit to the Russian people. Agricultural output plummeted in the former communist countries as thousands of cooperative farms were forcibly broken up. However, despite overwhelming support from the US, capitalist restoration did not go according to plan. In 1990 Bulgaria, for example, despite generous financial and organizational assistance from the Free Congress Foundation, the Bulgarian conservatives ended up a poor second to the communists, in what Western European observers judged to be a fair and open election. The same pattern emerged in Albania, where the democratically elected communist government won an overwhelming majority only to face demonstrations, a general strike, economic pressure from abroad, and campaigns of disruption financed by the National Endowment for Democracy and other US sources. During the 1996 Albanian elections, the socialist and other opposition parties withdrew hours before the polls closed in protest of the blatantly rigged vote aided by police intimidation and the stuffing of ballot boxes. Meanwhile, openly anti-Semitic groups, crypto-fascist parties, and hate campaigns resurfaced in Russia, Poland, Hungary, Ukraine, Belarus, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. Museums that commemorated the heroic anti-fascist resistance were closed down. Monuments to the struggle against Nazism were dismantled. Jewish cemeteries were desecrated, and xenophobic attacks against foreigners sharply increased. Throughout the process of capitalist restoration, no figure among the capitalist restorationists in the East had been more applauded by the US than Václav Havel, the first president of post-communist Czechoslovakia.
The first president of the anti-communist Czechoslovakia and later president of the Czech Republic, Václav Havel, another guy who was adored among some of the academics here, he took personal ownership of public properties that had belonged to his wealthy family 40 years before. Havel, the man of peace, sent Czech troops into the Gulf War, into the war that killed 100,000 Iraqi civilians. Havel sent arms to the fascist regime in Thailand. Havel voted with the United States to condemn human rights violations in Cuba, but he's never uttered a word of condemnation of human rights in El Salvador, Colombia, Guatemala, Indonesia, Thailand, and any other U.S. client state. Havel, the great Democrat, signed a law that made the advocacy of communism a felony with a penalty of up to 8 years imprisonment. He signed another law barring communists and former communists from employment in all public agencies. Havel warned labor unions not to involve themselves in politics. Some militant unions had their property taken from them and handed over to compliant company unions. In the Czech and Slovak republics, former aristocrats or their heirs were being given back all the lands and estates they had held before 1918 under the Austro-Hungarian autocracy.
In 1990, Bruce Gelb, head of the United States Information Agency, told a reporter that former communist countries would benefit economically from US business and education because, quote, the vipers, the bloodsuckers, the middlemen, that's what needs to be rehabilitated in the Soviet Union. That's what makes our kind of country click. And with the capitalist restoration in full swing, slowly but surely, the peoples of former communist nations had ample opportunity to learn what life was like in the free market paradise with the vipers, bloodsuckers, and middlemen. After the fall of communism, the living standard of the average Russian family fell by almost half as real income shrunk by as much as 30 to 40%. Unemployment rates rose as high as 30%, and workers toiled harder and longer for less, without sick leave, maternity leave, paid vacations, or other job benefits once taken for granted under communism. Rents and real estate prices skyrocketed, and numerous stock exchanges sprung up and gave rise to a new class of investors, speculators, and racketeers. Price deregulation produced rapid inflation as price controls were handed to the private sector. Addiction, prostitution, spousal abuse, child abuse, pollution, and suicide increased along with almost every other social ill. Doctors became grossly underpaid, nutritional levels and life expectancy declined, while child mortality, as well as physical illness and mental illness, increased. With the end of subsidized housing, homelessness in Moscow alone reached as high as 300,000. Women and the elderly who once felt free to sit in parks late at night no longer dared to venture out after dark. In the Republic of Georgia, violent criminal rings controlled much of the commerce, and military groups controlled most of the criminal rings. However, in addition to increased poverty, crime, prostitution, and vagrancy, the streets of Moscow also saw an increased number of luxury cars. With the socialist ethic giving way to private greed, corruption assumed new forms at all levels. The Russian security minister calculated that 1/3 of Russian oil and almost 1/2 of Russian nickel shipped out of the country was stolen. Government officials purchased goods from the private sector at twice the normal price in exchange for kickbacks. Factory directors sold state-made commodities at low prices to their own private firms, which then sold them at market prices for a vast profit. Over 100 racket syndicates extorted tribute from nearly 80% of Russian enterprises. Cultural life also dramatically declined after the fall of communism. Theaters went sparsely attended because tickets became too expensive. Subsidies for the arts and literature were severely cut. Symphony orchestras were disbanded or took to playing at block parties or other minor occasions. Books of Marxist or otherwise critical left perspectives were removed from bookstores and libraries. Education, once free, was made too costly for many to afford. Meanwhile, television and radio programs with a left perspective, including youth programs, were removed from the air as well. The new Russian constitution eliminated provisions that guaranteed women the right to paid maternity leave, job security during pregnancy, prenatal care, and affordable daycare. Women were being driven out of the professions in disproportionate numbers while being advised against receiving professional training. Divorce, abortion, and birth control were made far more difficult to obtain, and the autonomous region of Ingushetia even decriminalized polygamy and made it legal for women to be sold into marriage. And elsewhere, women were being sold in unprecedented numbers to the booming sex industry, catering to foreign and domestic businessmen. Life conditions for children also deteriorated significantly through the ex-communist world. School lunches, once free or low-priced, became too costly for many pupils to afford. Hungry children began to constitute such a serious social problem that instead of attending classes, children often were found hawking drinks or begging in the streets. Free summer camps were closed down, leaving many without socialization or activities outside of school. And it is therefore no surprise to find that juvenile crime is booming along with juvenile prostitution, all while youth rehabilitation funds are cut. While many Eastern European intellectuals remain fervent champions of the free market paradise, most workers and peasants no longer romanticize capitalism, having felt its unforgiving lash. Throughout Eastern Europe and the former USSR, many people begrudgingly admit that conditions were better under communism. Anti-communist dissidents who labored hard to overthrow the GDR were soon voicing their disappointments about German reunification. One old German woman working in a potato factory burst into tears after being asked if her life had changed after the fall of communism. It's not life, it's just existence. When the first anti-communist upheavals began in Eastern Europe in 1989, there were those on the left who said that if people in those countries discovered that they didn't like the free market system, then they could always return to some variant of socialism. But a few years of untrammeled free market marauding has left these nations to a point of no foreseeable return. Like other third world nations, the former communist countries are likely to remain in poverty indefinitely, so that a privileged few may continue to enjoy greater and greater opulence at the expense of the many. The peoples of Eastern Europe believed that they were going to keep all the social gains they had enjoyed under communism while adding on all of the consumerism of the West. In expecting to advance from second world to first world status, they had been rammed down into the third world. They wanted it all and were left with almost nothing. With the overthrow of communist governments in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, announcements about the morbid nature of Marxist dogma poured forth with renewed vigor. However, Marx's major work, Capital Volume 1, was a study not of existing socialism, which did not exist in his day, but of capitalism, which remains terribly relevant to our times. Therefore, it would make more sense to declare Marxism obsolete when capitalism is abolished rather than socialism. Marx and Engels' work was not a prophecy, nor were they correct about everything they wrote. But they were the founders of an imperfect and incomplete science directed towards understanding an economic system that leaves its bloody footprints upon the world as never before. Marxism is superior to mainstream bourgeois social science because its explanations deal with the imperatives of class power and political economy as the motor forces of history and society. Marx began from the premise that in order to live, human beings must produce. In other words, people cannot live without bread. This does not mean that all human activity can be reduced to material motives, but that all activity is linked to a material base. What people need for survival is found in nature, but rarely in a form suitable for immediate consumption. Labor, in furnishing materials from nature into a consumable form, therefore, not only becomes a primary condition of human existence, but also becomes one of the primary means through which people acquire knowledge, develop their material and cultural life, as well as new modes of social organization. The conflicting class interests that evolve around the productive forces shape the development of a social system. In a class society, the wealth produced by many is accumulated into the hands of relatively few, who translate their economic power into political and cultural power in order to better secure the exploitative social order that so favors them. The wealthy few live off the backs of the impoverished many. There can be no rich shareholders living in idle comfort without a mass of penniless slaves to support their luxurious lifestyle. There can be no lords who live in opulence without a mass of impoverished landless serfs who till the lord's land. So too, under capitalism, there can be no financial moguls and industrial tycoons without millions of underpaid and overworked employees. Big capital has no commitment to anything but capital accumulation, no loyalty to any nation, culture, territory, or peoples. It moves inexorably according to its inner imperative to accumulate at the highest possible rate without concern for human and environmental costs. Private profitability, making the largest possible profit from other people's labor rather than human need, is the determining condition of private investment. Given the pressures of competition and rising wages, capitalists must make technological innovations to increase their productivity and diminish their labor costs. But as more capital goods such as machinery, plants, technologies, and fuels are needed for production, the higher the fixed costs and the greater the pressure to increase productivity to maintain profit margins. But since the workers are not paid enough to buy back all the goods and services they produce, there is always the problem of a disparity between mass production and aggregate demand. If demand slackens, owners cut back on production and investment. The ensuing drop in the buying power of workers leads to a further decline and possibility of recession. Marx foresaw the tendency for profits to fall and for protracted recessions and economic stability to continuously recur and expand, which today have become international in scope. Marx understood that as wealth became more concentrated, poverty became more widespread, and the plight of working people ever more desperate. This expansionary tendency of the capitalist system is also seen in a steady growth of the working class, with industrial and service workers on a global scale. With growing misery and proletarianization, Marx predicted that the masses would eventually rise up, overthrow the bourgeoisie, and put the means of production under public ownership for the benefit of all. Today, the gap between America's rich and poor is greater than it has been in more than half a century, and is getting ever greater. The really big money is concentrated in a portion of the population so minuscule as to be judged statistically insignificant. There has been a general downgrading of the workforce. Regular employment is being replaced by contracted labor or temporary help, resulting in lower wages with fewer or no benefits. Many unions have been destroyed or seriously weakened. Protective government regulations are being rolled back or left unenforced, and there has been an increase in speed-ups, injuries, and other workplace abuses. Marx predicted that the proletariat would play a revolutionary role, not only because they had the most to gain from socialist revolution, but because of its historically unprecedented level of organization and consciousness as a laboring class. Unlike previously oppressed classes, the proletariat, mostly literate and heavily concentrated in urban areas, seemed capable of an unparalleled level of political development. It seemed inevitable that the workers would not only rebel against their oppressors, as had the slaves and serfs of previous epochs, but would seek to create an egalitarian, non-exploitative social order as never before seen in history. Marx's predictions regarding revolution have not materialized, as there has never been a successful proletariat revolution in any advanced capitalist society. Oppressive social conditions may cry out for revolution, but that does not mean that revolution is forthcoming. Marx underestimated the extent to which the advanced capitalist state could use its wealth and power to create a variety of institutions that retard and distract popular consciousness or blunt discontent through reform programs. As the working class developed, so too did the capitalist state, whose function has been to protect the capitalist class, with its mechanisms of police suppression as well as its information and cultural hegemony. Repeatedly dismissed as an obsolete doctrine, Marxism retains a compelling contemporary quality because it is less a body of fixed dicta and more a method of looking beyond immediate appearances to see the inner qualities and moving forces that shape social relations and history itself. To understand capitalism, one first has to strip away the appearances presented by its ideology. Then, we can see the essential point of Marx's analysis, that the social structure and class order prefigure our behavior in many ways. Marxists understand that a class society is not just a divided society, but one ruled by class power, with the state playing a crucial role in maintaining the existing class structure, where explanations for structural violence are attributed to the criminal or antisocial behaviors of individuals. Racism, for example, is presented as essentially a bad set of attitudes held by racists. But racism also involves institutional structures and systemic power. There's little analysis of what makes racism so functional for a class society, but instead, race and class are treated as separate, often mutually exclusive concepts in competition with each other. However, those who have an understanding of class power know that as class contradictions deepen and come to the fore, racism becomes not less, but more important as a factor in class conflict. Marxists also point out that racism is used as a means of depressing wages by keeping a segment of the laboring force vulnerable to super-exploitation, and therefore, Marxism rejects the prevailing view of structural racism as limited to individual social institutions, such as the church, the army, police, university, media, medicine, or workplace. These institutions, far from being neutral and independent bastions, are heavily shaped by class interests and class power, while the major institutions of society are tied to the big business class. In the Marxist view, the concept of a class of people signifies a relation to other classes of people. There can be no lords without serfs, no masters without slaves, no capitalists without workers. But more than just a sociological category, class is a relationship to the means of production. It is remarkable, for instance, that some political scientists have studied the presidency and Congress for decades without uttering a word about capitalism, without so much as a sidelong glance about how the imperatives of a capitalist political economic order play such a crucial role in prefiguring the political agenda. That's because when we think without Marx's perspective, without considering class interests and class power, we seldom ask why certain things happen, and therefore fail to associate social problems with the socio-economic forces that create them, and we learn to truncate our own critical thinking. Suppose, for example, we started with a particular story about how child labor in Indonesia is contracted by multinational corporations at near starvation wages. Then suppose we crossed another line and said that these repressive arrangements would not prevail if it were not for the generous military aid from the United States. Now, suppose we pointed out that the conditions found in Indonesia exist in scores of other countries. Then, suppose we crossed the most serious line of all, and instead of just deploying this fact, we also asked why successive US administrations involve themselves in these unsavory pursuits throughout the world. Such an analysis, hurriedly sketched here, would essentially amount to a Marxist critique of capitalist imperialism. We tried to explain the particular situation, child labor in Indonesia, in terms of a larger set of social relations, capitalism and imperialism, and therefore, this type of presentation would be rejected out of hand as quote-unquote ideological. We have crossed too many lines. This is how capitalism and its various institutions affect the most personal dimensions of everyday life in ways not readily evident. A Marxist approach helps us see the connections to which we were previously blind, and relate effects to causes, and to replace the arbitrary and the mysterious with the regular and the necessary. A Marxist perspective helps us see injustice as rooted in systemic causes that go beyond individual choice, and to view crucial developments not as neutral happenings, but as the intended consequences of class power and interest. This is why, for all the misrepresentations and suppression, Marxist scholarship survives. While not having all the answers, it does have superior explanatory power, telling us something about reality that bourgeois scholarship refuses to do. Marxism offers the kind of subversive truths that cause fear and trembling among the high and mighty, those who live atop a mountain of lies. Those who occupy the higher circles of wealth and power are keenly aware of their own interests, but are also careful to discourage public awareness of the class power they wield. The ruling class has labored long to leave the impression that it does not exist, that it does not own the lion's share of almost everything, and does not exercise a vastly disproportionate influence over the democratic state. Instead of class struggle between worker and owner, every politician, publicist, and pundit makes the middle class the object of their heartfelt concern. But it is verboten to refer to the exploiting or exploited classes, the capitalist system, or the accumulation of corporate wealth at the expense of labor. The much admired and much pitied middle class includes almost everyone and serves as a conveniently amorphous concept that masks the exploitation and inequality of social relations. It is a class label that denies the actuality of class power. The C word is also used when referring to the so-called underclass, that desperate lot that live on the lowest rung of society, who get the least of everything while being regularly blamed for their own victimization. Discriminatory references to the presumed deficiencies of underclass people are acceptable because they reinforce the existing social hierarchy and justify the unjust treatment accorded to society's most vulnerable elements. Even among persons normally identified as progressive, one finds a reluctance to deal with the reality of capitalist class power. Many progressives are so rabidly anti-communist as to seize upon any conceivable notion except class power to explain what is happening in the world. The leftists' anything but class, or ABC theorists, say we are giving too much attention to class, but in reality, mainstream academic publications, radical journals, and scholars' conferences rarely focus or pay much attention to class power of any kind, and often have yet to discover it. Today, insofar as class is accorded any attention in academic social science, pop sociology, or media commentary, it is as a kind of demographic trait or occupational status among a number of other cultural identities. Mainstream social scientists and ABC theorists simply fail to consider the dynamic interrelationships surrounding the processes of surplus value production and extraction that give class its significance. The relationship between worker and owner is essentially an exploitative one, involving the constant transfer of wealth from those who labor but do not own to those who own but do not labor. These class realities, which permeate our society, determine much about our capacity to pursue our own self-interests. It is ironic that ABC theorists should deem Marxism and class struggle to be largely irrelevant at the very time that class power is becoming increasingly transparent. Corporate concentrations of wealth and power are more rapacious than ever, while at the same time, global poverty is growing at a faster rate than the overall population. But ABC theorists are stuck in nihilism because they preach the failures of Soviet socialism and see the working class as generally incapable of revolution. They offer no tangible alternative or political organization to challenge the class system. Instead, they uphold the works of communist leaders such as Antonio Gramsci as a source of cultural theory while almost entirely evacuating his class analysis. Other ABC theorists have developed a politics rooted in an array of identity groups centering around ethnic, gender, cultural, and lifestyle issues. These groups treat their respective grievances as something apart from class struggle and have almost nothing to say about the increasingly harsh class injustices perpetrated against us all. Identity groups tend to emphasize their distinctiveness and their separateness from each other, thus fractionalizing collective political organization. They make important contributions around issues that are often overlooked by others and are particularly salient to them, but they also downplay their common interests in overlooking the common class enemy we face. The forces that impose injustice and economic exploitation are the same ones that propagate racism, sexism, militarism, ecological devastation, homophobia, xenophobia, and the like. To embrace a class analysis is not to deny the significance of identity issues, but to deepen our understanding of how these issues are linked to the overall social structure of political and economic power. This is why it is crucial for social scientists to closely consider how class power is a factor in influencing the shape of whatever social phenomenon we are studying. Our society functions in a way that a select few live in great opulence while millions of people, shackled to financial insecurity, toil endlessly at a tremendous cost to the quality of their lives. Meanwhile, the owning class exercises exclusive, undemocratic control, not only over the livelihood of millions, but over civic life itself. Again and again, we are asked to choose between freedom and security, when in fact the freedom of the ruling class undermines our security. Freedom for the ruling class is the freedom to accumulate endless amounts of money and wealth, which is pursued without moral restraint. Meanwhile, those who challenge the endless, heartless, unprincipled accumulation of the very wealthy are repressed with extreme forms of violence. With its never-ending exploitation, expansion, and indifference to environmental costs, capitalism appears determined to stand outside of nature. Global warming is caused by tropical deforestation, motor vehicle exhaust, and other fossil fuel emissions, creating a greenhouse effect, trapping heat close to the Earth's surface and shrinking the ozone layer that shields us from the sun's deadliest rays. At the same time, the rise in pollution has given us acid rain, soil erosion, silting of waterways, shrinking of grasslands, disappearing water supplies and wetlands, as well as the obliteration of thousands of species, with hundreds more on the endangered list. Conservatives maintain that there is no environmental crisis, but that's because they live and experience a different class reality than everyone else. They reside in places where the air is somewhat better than in the low and middle income areas. They have access to food that is organically raised. Toxic dumps and freeways are not situated in their neighborhoods. Pesticide sprays are not poured over their trees and gardens. Clear-cutting does not desolate their ranches, estates, and vacation spots. Even when their children succumb to a dreaded disease like cancer, they do not link the tragedy to environmental factors, and they deny that there is a larger problem because they themselves create that problem and owe much of their wealth to it. The patterns of environmental activists going missing or being assassinated are part of the same processes that produce dividends for the trust funds of the upper classes. Solar, wind, and tidal energy systems could help avert ecological disaster, but they would bring disaster to the rich oil cartels. Industrial capital treats the environment like a septic tank, pours chemicals into the atmosphere, dumps effluent into the river, and turns waterways into sewers because it is more profitable than ensuring clean water and air. Immense and immediate gain for oneself is far more compelling than a general loss shared by the public. This is why the ecology movement is so profoundly subversive to capitalism. Those corporate interests who once hired black shirts to destroy democracy and waged merciless war against the Reds have no trouble making war against the Greens. Those who have brought us poverty, the exploitation of the wage system, unemployment, and other oppressive economic conditions are not too troubled about bringing us ecological crises either. The plutocrats are more wedded to their wealth than the earth upon which they live, more concerned with the fate of their fortunes than with the fate of the planet. The struggle over environmentalism is therefore part of the class struggle itself, a fact that has escaped far too many environmentalists. We see, therefore, that what is at stake is not only economic justice, but democracy itself and the survival of the biosphere. The only countervailing force that might eventually turn things in a better direction is an informed and mobilized citizenry. Whatever our shortcomings, the people are our best hope. Indeed, we are the people. Whether or not the ruling circles still wear black shirts, and whether or not their opponents are Reds, the struggle for a future continues today, tomorrow, and throughout history. This video was based on Michael Parenti's book, Black Shirts and Reds: Rational Fascism and the Overthrow of Communism.